Hello, I'm the Ever-Prince, and welcome to Homebrew Heresy, where we bring your heretical ideas to life in the grim darkness of the 40k universe. Today on Homebrew Heresy, we're celebrating the return of the greatest cartoon of the 90s, because today we're going to be making a homebrew based on the leader of the X-Men himself. Scott Summers, otherwise known as Cyclops, and one of the coolest characters in Marvel Comics. That was until Fox ruined him, but it's okay, because those dark times are over, and we finally have some good Cyclops content. Among other things. Oh yeah, that's nice. Sorry about that. Got distracted by something. At any rate, let's begin by covering his origins and history. Scott Summers, otherwise known as Cyclops, was born to a wealthy family in America, at some point in the 21st century. It's unclear given how comics are constantly changing and undergoing retcons and reboots, so let's just keep to the basics. Scott was the youngest of three brothers, and probably the weakest, when you compare him to Havoc and Vulcan. After losing his family in a terrible plane crash, wherein everyone except his parents, who sometimes do survive, was killed, Scott would go on to be captured and experimented on by Mr. Sinister. During his capture, Scott would suffer terrible mental manipulation and brainwashing, all of which meant not only to break his mind, but turn him into an unwilling pawn to the Mad Doctor. Eventually, Scott would be released and go on to join Charles Xavier's School for Gifted Children, otherwise known as Mutant High School. Here, Scott would spend the rest of his childhood and teenage years studying under Xavier to become not only a well-adjusted young man, but a competent and dependable leader to the next generation of X-Men. During his tenure, Scott would earn the respect of his team, and while he would still make mistakes, he was quick to rectify them, and learn from them, using his incredibly dangerous and often underestimated mutant power to achieve victory, even in impossible situations. Over the course of his life, Scott would not only be the leader of many X-Men teams, but would eventually go on to succeed Charles Xavier as the leader of the school. Though this usually happens after Scott blasts Professor X to ash at point-blank range. Don't worry, because it's comics, of course Charles Xavier has to come back. But not before we have the magnum opus of Cyclops' development. Scott would lose everyone he loves, and watches the dream of his mentor died around him. Watching as once proud and diverse mutant race became an endangered species, with only 198 mutants left. Scott was not only the leader of the X-Men, but the only person able to save them from total extinction. This pressure would eventually cause Scott Summers to make necessary, if cruel decisions in order to keep his people alive. During an intense battle, with growing anti-mutant sentiments on the rise, Scott would end up consuming the Phoenix Force, which is widely considered to be a bad idea. And as the Avatar of the Phoenix, Scott would become not only a temporary antagonist in the Marvel Universe, but one of its strongest characters overall. However, as a true testament to Scott's character, he would eventually reject the Phoenix's power, which is honestly one of my favorite moments in comics. All in all, Scott has a very deep and rich character arc and personality. From student to mentor to leader to villain, and eventually a true hero once again. Currently, Scott and the rest of mankind have abandoned humanity and taken up refuge on Krakoa. Weapons and armor. Scott Summers rarely uses any form of weapons, with the exception of his visor, created using ruby quartz to suppress and contain his power. If Scott Summers ever does lose access to his visor, not only will he not be able to control his powers, but his destructive power will be magnified. Methods of war. Scott Summers prefers to lead from the front, acting as a symbol to his allies. While he can and has had to use subterfuge in order to accomplish his goals, Scott does prefer to maintain his identity as a face of mutant kind. Overall, I think we've covered everything we need in order to create this homebrew, save for a few questions I'm sure people are going to have to ask. First, since this is a character and not an entire faction like before, I'm sure people are going to ask, am I doing a single character? No, I'll be generalizing the traits of this character to an entire faction. For abilities that are unique to their character, I'd say it should be common enough that an entire faction's veterans or their sergeant equivalent should be able to use it. So, with that question covered, I think it's time we begin by finding out our goals. For goal number 1, we're going to need punch lasers. We're going to need some way to weaponize our blindness and, if possible, use technology to further amplify it. Second, an inhuman human. We're going to need to be the poster child of mutant sentiments and deal with the stigma that comes with it, including being endangered or unwanted species. Third, paragon of leadership. We're going to need to be able to take the actions necessary to survive. Now, we can start by looking at 3 major factions to decide which one of these ones we're going to be using for this homebrew. However, before we can do that, make sure to blast those like and subscribe buttons to make sure Cyclops survives his free fall. So, while goals 1 and 3 are pretty faction agnostic, but it's goal number 2 that's really important, given that we're going to need to be human, or at least firmly human, for it to work. So that limits us to either Chaos or the Imperium. However, given goal number 3 points for demand for leadership and saving your species, we can kind of assume that that isn't Chaos, given that's pretty antithetical to what Chaos stands for. Meaning, for this homebrew, we're going to have to join the Imperium of Man. Now that we've got our main factions out of the way, we can work on deciding what sub-faction we'll be going with. So, looking at our options, we really only have a few possibilities. There's always the Asher Militarum, for their human nature and diverse skill set, indicative of the wide range of abilities present across the mutant population. Besides them, another option is the Adeptus Astartes. Their inhuman nature is a regular topic for debate and scorn among the rather puritanical members of the Imperium. Finally, for our third option, we're going to be Imperial Knights, given their rarity, rigid class structure similar to the mutant power rankings, and of course, eye lasers. Now, looking at our options, the first that's gotta go is going to be the Imperial Knights. While they do fit on the most surface levels, the Imperial Knights are rarely suffering the same degree of scorn that the mutants have to endure. Additionally, Cyclops is a leader who rallies his allies to his aids. The Knights are, aside from working beside fellow members of their household, function more akin to lone wolves as opposed to actual leaders. Next up is the Imperial Guard. While the lasguns do fit the punch lasers we're looking for, given how weak they are, one of the biggest signs against them is their sheer numbers. Now, while the option for abhumans is a possibility given the brutal nature they're forced to endure, the Beastman's loyalty is one driven by sheer hatred towards themselves and their kin. Cyclops, however, lacks any sense of shame towards mutants, and instead wishes for their survival over humanity. So, finally, we have the Adeptus Astartes. Given what our goals are, the Space Marines do fit the necessary requirements we need for this homebrew. First off, their optic blast could easily be worked into the chapter as some kind of digital weapon, or possibly even a psychic power. They also fit the second goal of being inhuman humans, dealing with a great degree of stigma as a result of their nature. Something we can further intensify if we play up the psychic powers aspect I mentioned before. For the third goal, Marines fit that set to get to a T, in order to survive the grim dark galaxy. We could even add a bit of the X-Men abandoning humanity / the Imperium in this case for their lore. Now that we have our sub-faction, we can work by breathing life into it. Starting off, since we're using Space Marines as our sub-faction of choice, we're going to need to figure out something integral to all Space Marine chapters. Their founding legions. While I think any chapter could work, I think taking advantage of the comment I mentioned before about the Optic Blast being similar to psychic powers is going to give us what we need. Given the loathing most of the Imperium has towards psychers and witches, even a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes would be victims to similar opinions. So, given that, it should be obvious the legion we're going to be going with for this homebrew. The Thousand Sons of Magnus the Red. Now, if you're going to scream heresy, then clearly you must be new here. While a chapter tracing its lineage back to a traitor legion isn't exactly a common thing, it happens a lot more often than you realize. Now we've established a legion, we gotta devise the founding. And while I would say it doesn't matter at the end, I think in this case it actually does matter. Given we've covered Scott being captured and experimented on by Mr. Sinister, we can use something similar for this chapter. The 23rd founding, otherwise known as Cursed Founding, is known for the wide range of mutated Astartes that were made during this time. It's been widely speculated that during this founding, all the gene seed lines that were used were altered or modified in some way, meaning the possibility that during this founding the gene seed of Magnus the Red was tampered with in order to improve any corruptive traits in there. We can even add in one more bit of connection. Given the existence of the Order of Sinister, which is in charge of the dreaded Psi Titans, we could potentially add something that they were involved in the development of this chapter. My thought process, to further reflect the mutant powers and the fact that most develop later in life, we can say that the Astartes of this chapter all possess a latent psychic power. However, like mutants, their power only awakens after fully becoming Astartes. This could also be a byproduct of the gene seed being adjusted or tampered with, perhaps to limit any potential treachery this chapter might have in the future. Now, I like the idea that these chapters suffer from the same conditions Cyclops does, that being the inability to control their powers. So for this, we can have this chapter's latent psychic powers awaken later in life, and because of both their training and just the way the chapter's gene seed was modified, the chapter can project their psychic powers through their eyes. Now, adding to this, because Cyclops is blind without his ruby glasses, we can borrow this, saying the chapter potentially removes their eyes as they start to develop these psychic powers. Finally, the ruby glasses. These could be easily recreated by saying that after they remove the eyes, like I mentioned before, they replace them with red crystals, given the fact that psyker shit is shiker shit, and it doesn't have to make sense half the time. This could also lead to chapter regularly being hated or despised by their fellow Astartes, not even bringing up their parent legion or their founding, if either are known. Regardless, though, this could also be the reason the chapter adopts a pragmatic approach to warfare, similar to Scott during his later story arc, and potentially leading to the chapter becoming traitors or at least renegades later on. Maybe even including that 198 number that I mentioned before, saying that maybe after a brutal and avoidable tragedy, only 198 Astartes survived, and this is what drove the chapter to become renegades of the Imperium. But I'm just spitballing right now. We can easily work on this. Let's begin with the Homebrew. The Binary Suns are a loyalist Space Marine chapter of the Curse founding, and operate deep within the Ultima Segmentum. Successors of an unknown chapter, it's been widely implied they are successors of the Thousand Sons Legion, and their Primarch, Magnus the Red, primarily due to the chapter's possession of an abnormally high amount of Psykers within their ranks. Operating from the death world of Krakoa, a living plasticized organism that hunts the many organisms that call its surface home. The chapter recruits from the tribal populations of humans that live across Krakoa, alongside several nearby worlds, including the crime-infested hive world of Mahati. However, when the chapter does arrive on these worlds in search of recruits, they only do so after an extensive psychic ritual in order to find a particular recruit. The Binary Sons, while a highly devoted and loyal chapter to the Imperium, repeated dishonors at the hands of their cousin chapters has led the chapter preferring to fight alone, and far from Imperial rule. The chapter's high number of psychers within their ranks has caused the chapter to tie positions within their ranks to the development of psychic power. Typically, Binary Sons Astartes begin to develop psychic powers near the end of their first decade, wherein they are placed within the chapter's reserve companies. Individual squads of the Binary Sons are all led by a veteran psyker, and serve as leaders and mentors to their less skilled squad mates. A unique idiosyncrasy of the chapter is that the individual Astartes grow in age, their psychic power also grows within, causing the Marines' eyes to begin to burn with warp energy. To deal with this, the chapter has ritualistically remove and sacrifice one of their eyes, and replace it with a Crowan ruby, a psychoreactive crystal that both stabilizes and focuses psychic power. When an Astartes performs this ritual, they are considered a veteran, and can go on to lead a squad of Marines themselves, with only the oldest and most venerated of the chapter being old enough and powerful enough to need to replace both of their eyes. This, combined with the fact these psychic Astartes can also use these ruby gems as psychic focus to project their magic from. This is where the chapter earns its name, the Binary Sons. The ruby-colored psychic energy looks almost like a solar flare being fired, while the binary comes from the veteran Astartes having to replace both their eyes. While this is a symbol of great pride among the chapter, it has earned them a grim reputation, alongside unending accusations of heresy. Accusations that would culminate in the Avengers War, wherein the Avengers chapter of the Adeptus Astartes went to war with the Binary Sons, and nearly wiped them out. It was only after the opening of the Great Rift that the tide of war shifted to the Binary Sons, and their psychic powers exploded, and allowed them to push back the Avengers and retake their homeworld. Currently, the chapter is struggling to stay alive with only 198 Marines. With their growing resentment towards the Imperium, this chapter has officially seceded from the Imperium and gone on to become renegades. So that's the lore of the Binary Sons chapter. Obviously, I took as much inspiration as I could from the original source material, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Now, given everything we've gone over, I really think infantry is the main point of this army, which is why we're going to be looking at all the combat patrols. We're going to have to go with the Death Watch combat patrol. The singular focus on infantry units, as well as a wide range of character-esque units within it, is a great choice for our Binary Sons. Though, while I personally dislike this combat patrol, since it only clocks in at 395 points, and is no standout centerpiece model, I think it fits pretty well. Additionally, because of the low points, which would normally be a drawback, I think this can actually help us expand our army even further. So, for our next option, we're going to go with the Eradicator squads, given both Cyclops and the Eradicators have trouble controlling their streams. In the end, these two combined gives us around 485 points, a pretty decent start to a full-on homebrew army. So far, I think that's all we're going to need for today. And if you've made it this far, you probably like what you're seeing, so why not check out one of my other videos. Bye!